On the morning of February 28, 1887, the staff of the Marquette Pavilion, a private lakeside residence turned seasonal hotel, unlocked the door to room 11 for breakfast service. What they found within would unsettle Ashbury's elite for decades to come. The chamber, reserved indefinitely for one of the town's most luminous social figures, stood eerily silent, a stillness that seemed to pulse with an unspoken dread. The silk drapes hung heavy and unmoving, shielding the room from the pale light of the cold Connecticut dawn. Their deep burgundy folds, thick with dust at the hems, fell like theater curtains over tall windows, blocking out the brittle, frost-laced world beyond. A quiet hush blanketed the space, an absence not of sound, but of life, as though the house itself held its breath in the hours before morning took full hold. The air inside was tinged with the ghost of last night's perfume, a mix of aged vermouth and faint lavender, the kind worn long ago by women who no longer walked these halls. On a side table near the faded settee, a half-finished glass of the liquor sat abandoned, the rim faintly smudged with lipstick the color of dried roses. The drink's amber surface had stilled, catching the dim light like a relic in amber, untouched since the music had stopped. Beside it, propped against a small silver frame, was a black and white photograph. 3 figures, blurred by time and careless handling. The middle figure, a man in a sharp collar and hollow eyes, stared past the lens with a gaze that seemed to know things no one else did. The edges of the photo were curled, singed slightly in one corner, burned, perhaps, in a moment of indecision or regret. It rested atop a leather-bound album, its pages brittle, untouched for years, perhaps decades. Across the room, the phonograph remained silent, its horn catching light from the dying coals in the hearth. A single record sat on the platter, Chopin, one could guess, from the half-closed sleeve nearby. It had played softly the night before, notes trailing through the house like whispers, weaving through walls too old and too knowing. On the writing desk by the window sat a letter, folded once with meticulous care. The parchment was yellowing at the edges, but its center bore the faint watermark of Solmare Hall, a crest long thought forgotten. No signature adorned it, and no name addressed it. Just a few lines in elegant ink, so sharp and deliberate they might have been carved rather than written. It was the kind of letter not meant to be read aloud, and certainly not meant to be sent. A brass key lay next to it, darkened with age, and engraved with the same crest as the letterhead. Its teeth were unusually shaped, cut not for a door, but perhaps for something older. A chest, a drawer, or maybe a passage not marked on any map, known only to those who once called this place home. Outside, the wind stirred the bare limbs of trees in the overgrown garden, rattling dead ivy against stone walls. But inside, time had paused, holding the room in a quiet limbo. Solmare Hall had always kept its secrets well, and this morning, like so many before it, felt as though one of them was just on the verge of waking. There were no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no chaos. Just an absence so complete it felt staged, as if the room itself had conspired to erase its occupant. Evelyne Moreau, heiress, philanthropist, and the winter queen of Ashbury's golden society, had vanished. Her slippers lay neatly by the bed, her travel trunk remained locked, and her perfume lingered faintly in the air, a floral and powdery scent like a memory refusing to fade. Within hours, word of her disappearance rippled through the town's inner circles, carried on the hushed breaths of servants and the clinking of crystal glasses at dinner tables. By sundown, 4 of Ashbury's most prominent families, the Beaksleys, the Arundels, the Kendishes, and the Morgans, had contacted the constabulary, not out of concern for her safety, but to demand discretion. They sought to bury the story before it could stain their impeccable reputations. By the end of the week, an entire chapter of American high society was already rewriting its pages, erasing Evelyne Moreau as if she had never existed. But to understand her vanishing, one must look beyond the suite at the Marquette Pavilion. One must peer into the silken folds of Ashbury's elite, into old rail fortunes, newer sins, and secrets so well guarded that entire rooms had been designed to conceal them. Before we delve deeper, I have a request for you. If stories like this intrigue you, tales meant to be forgotten, whispered only in the shadows, Subscribe and share where you're listening from, because what happened to Evelyne wasn't just an Ashbury story. Its shadows stretched into Boston, into Washington, D.C., perhaps even into the hidden corners of your own family history. And it began, as most tragedies do, with beauty, charm, and the illusion of control. In 1878, Ashbury was a name unknown to most Americans, a quiet hamlet nestled along the shores of East Candlewood Lake. But for the 5 banking and railroad dynasties that had quietly purchased half the shoreline, it was already the new Newport, a haven of wealth and privilege, shielded from the Atlantic winds by towering pines and an almost palpable silence. In the waning years of the Gilded Age, when wealth was not just accumulated but displayed like art, the country's most powerful families retreated from the chaos of the cities each summer to their palatial estates nestled in the cooler reaches of New England. These were no simple getaways. They were monuments to ambition and legacy. Summer homes crafted in the image of Europe's finest residences. Drawing inspiration from Renaissance Italy and the chateaux of the Loire Valley, they built grand villas with colonnaded halls that echoed with the soft footfalls of silk slippers and whispered intrigues. Tall arched windows made of imported Bohemian glass glistened like crystal mirrors in the morning sun, throwing rainbows across parquet floors. Marble staircases, imported tile mosaics, and hand-painted ceilings adorned even the least trafficked rooms. Every detail, from the iron-forged door handles to the silk-threaded drapery, was selected not out of necessity, but to declare a very specific truth, that these families belonged to a rarefied class whose wealth not only shaped industry but dictated fashion, culture, and the tempo of society itself. And among these opulent retreats stood Solmare Hall, an estate that commanded the shoreline of Lake Merrowmere like a ship made of stone and glass. It belonged to Alaric and Evelyne Moreau, an enigmatic pair whose names were etched not just into social registries, but into the whispered legends passed around dinner tables and ballrooms alike. Theirs was not a love story, nor strictly a partnership. It was a union forged by legacy and preserved through sheer will, a perfect reflection of the estate they had created. Solmare Hall was not the largest of the summer homes, nor the most flamboyant, but it was the one most spoken about in quiet tones. Its facade, with its twin bell towers and sweeping verandas, watched over the lake like a sentinel. Beneath it, cellars ran deep, far deeper than those of neighboring estates, built not only for the storage of rare wines and imported delicacies, but for the containment of things best kept in the dark. Whispered rumors spoke of sealed rooms, hidden archives, and keys long since lost to the depths of the lake itself. Evelyne Moreau, known across states as the Pearl of Merrowmere, ruled her estate with poise and precision. Her garden parties were the envy of the region, her taste in art unrivaled, her guest list meticulously curated to reflect her own social aspirations. Alaric, a quieter presence, kept mostly to his study and private library, where the light rarely reached and the curtains remained drawn. But behind the elegance and refinement, Solmare Hall held a gravity all its own. Guests who visited for a single evening often returned changed, subtly at first and then profoundly. There was something in the air, in the stone, in the water beyond the dock. Something that lingered, because Solmare Hall was never just a house. It was a performance, a fortress, and perhaps, for those who looked too closely, a warning. She had not always been Evelyne Moreau. Once, she was Evelyne Desamps, daughter of a French banker who fled Paris after the 1848 uprisings, seeking asylum and fortune in New York. Her mother, a Connecticut miller's daughter, died young, leaving Evelyne with a grief that shaped her and a radiant poise that made her irresistible from her debutante days. To those who valued beauty as currency, she was a prize beyond measure. Her marriage to Alaric Moreau in 1875 united two empires, his in steel and rails, hers in European assets and social cachet. But it was Evelyne, not Alaric, who became the glittering heart of Ashbury's summer season. She spoke 4 languages fluently, hosted twilight recitals beneath gaslit pavilions, and patronized an obscure Hungarian violinist who would later perform at the White House. She was not just admired, she was indispensable. Every dinner table where she sat became a marketplace of influence. A single glance from her could elevate a reputation or cast it into ruin. The Ashbury Standard ran a column titled Lady of the Lake, chronicling her every gown, guest, and whispered opinion. She was unshakable, or so it seemed, until the moment she wasn't. And what followed her fall was not merely scandal. It was erasure. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To grasp why her disappearance rattled not just Ashbury but cities like Boston, Baltimore, and even the House Ways and Means Committee, we must turn back to 1885. A year when a man with a pencil behind his ear and a leather case of blueprints arrived in town. A man named Lucian Varelli, whose name was as much a mystery as the secrets he carried. In the winter of 1885, Ashbury glittered with its usual borrowed elegance. Paris gowns swaying in echoing drawing rooms, brandy served by gaslight, and a hushed cruelty refined only by the wealthy. At the center stood Evelyne Moreau, 37 years old that season, an age when women of her circle were expected to retreat gracefully into the background, managing charities and whispering behind fans. But Evelyne Moreau defied the quiet decline expected of women as the years passed. In fact, she seemed to grow more formidable with each season. Age did not soften her edges. It sculpted them. Where others faded into the background, Evelyne became more luminous, more precise, like a diamond under new light. Winter did not wither her, it crowned her. She wore it with authority, as if the frost itself bowed in her presence. Her gowns took on the pale gleam of snowdrifts. Her voice, already measured and melodic, acquired the calm clarity of ice cracking over deep water. Among the society of Ashbury, she was no longer seen as simply a woman of means or even of influence. She had evolved into something else entirely. To speak her name was to evoke a whole atmosphere. The scent of white lilacs in bloom, the hush of footsteps over imported Turkish carpets, the slow, deliberate chime of midnight bells drifting from the steeple of St. Helena's Chapel. People did not gossip about Evelyne. They theorized, they speculated, they admired from afar. She was not merely observed, she was interpreted. In drawing rooms and dinner parties, her name surfaced like the opening line of a legend. Young debutantes measured themselves against her mythos, hoping to catch the angle of her poise or the rhythm of her speech. Politicians and poets alike sought her attention, not out of romantic desire, but because a glance from Evelyne carried the weight of endorsement, and perhaps something more intangible, something bordering on fate. Yet there was something untouchable about her, something almost spectral. No one remembered seeing her laugh, not in earnest. Her smile, always graceful, was often more enigmatic than warm. She could walk into a room and silence it without speaking a word. Her presence didn't demand attention. It wove itself into the walls, into the very air. You didn't notice her entering. You realized, suddenly, that the atmosphere had changed. She was not cruel, nor was she overtly kind. She moved with the precision of someone who understood the mechanics of perception, who curated her mystery the way others arranged flowers. Some said she had once been deeply in love. Others claimed she had never truly known affection, and that this absence had crystallized within her into elegance. Either way, no one knew for certain, and perhaps that was the point. The lake winds never tousled her hair. The snow never clung to the hem of her gown. Even time, it seemed, refused to settle on her shoulders. It was as if Evelyne Moreau existed slightly outside the rules that governed the rest of the world, neither entirely in the past nor fully of the present. She wasn't a woman anymore, not in the way society defined it. She had become a phenomenon, a symbol, a legend written in the quiet spaces between heartbeats and snowfall. Something rare, something eternal, something mythic. Alaric Morrow had long since faded from her side in all but name. He traveled to Pittsburgh, Detroit, Chicago, tending to his ironworks and forging alliances with senators whose favor could sway fortunes. When he was home, he watched her with a mix of admiration and resentment, like a man observing a candle burning at both ends. Evelyne, for her part, remained faithful, not to him, but to her own restless spirit. That winter, she turned her attention to a new obsession: architecture. Solmare Hall's conservatory, built hastily in the early years of their marriage, was now considered outdated. She wanted something grander: a winter garden, a private performance space to host composers, libertines, and the occasional scandalous poet. And so, into her world stepped Lucian Varelli, a man whose arrival would change everything. He came to Ashbury not with the deference of a tradesman, but with the confidence of a man who knew he was being studied. Tall, olive-skinned, with a neatly trimmed beard and a voice that seemed to carry secrets, he claimed to have studied under Viollet Leduc in France, worked on a summer theater in Amalfi, and restored a palazzo outside Siena. Evelyne, with her twice-traveled European past, recognized the names and the lies, but she didn't mind. Not at first. Their first conversation took place in Solmer's solarium over tea, witnessed only by two maids. Afterward, Evelyne walked the eastern lawn alone, her gloves off, her breath blooming in the frosted air. She didn't speak at dinner that night, and the next morning, she requested Varelli's return. Their meetings grew frequent. Sketches turned to drafts, then to color renderings, then to rehearsals with musicians to test acoustics, though the renovations hadn't yet begun. Soon, he was seen arriving at Solmer 3-4 times a week, then daily. Rumors began, soft as a bow drawn across strings. The Moreau chef, a Sardinian named Raphael, noted Varelli stayed past dusk. The driver who brought him from the rail station claimed he often left after midnight, or not at all. A maid reported seeing Evelyne descend the back staircase barefoot, carrying a bottle of absinthe and humming an aria she'd never sung before. Yet there was no proof, and Evelyne had built her life like a fortress. She had outlasted envy and lust, learned to navigate scandal without acknowledging it. But that winter, something shifted. She laughed more loudly at dinner parties, wore crimson where she once preferred navy, canceled a planned trip to New York for a women's suffrage fundraiser, an absence that raised eyebrows. Ashbury watched, waiting for the inevitable eruption. And so, dear listener, we stand at the precipice of a tale where beauty meets betrayal, where power masks murder, and where a woman's curiosity became her undoing. Stay with me as we unravel the threads of Evelyne Moreau's vanishing. A story that echoes still, a warning carved into the silence of Ashbury's gilded past. And so, we return to the winter of 1885, where the arrival of Lucien Varelli marked the beginning of a slow unraveling in Ashbury's pristine facade. He moved through the town with the grace of a shadow, his lean elegance and foreign accent captivating those who crossed his path. He claimed a past studded with prestigious commissions, restorations in France, theaters in Italy, but the truth was a tapestry of half-truths and outright fabrications. The monogram on a letter from a supposed Duke of Doran belonged to a lineage extinct since 1872, and the watermark on an Italian commission traced back to a paper mill lost to a flood 5 years prior. Yet in Ashbury, where wealth blinded inquiry, no one questioned what they weren't prepared to understand, especially when it arrived in fine Italian boots. Lucien knew this well. His life was built on selling mystery, his name a carefully chosen alias, his Venetian summers a stolen memory from 1879. What was verifiable, however, painted a chilling pattern. He had overseen renovations in Pittsburgh for the daughters of coal barons, who quietly relocated after his departure. In Richmond, he designed a private gallery for a widow who vanished from society pages, her estate sold at a loss. In each case, he arrived, charmed, became indispensable, and left with valuables, monetary and otherwise, slipping through his fingers like sand. Ashbury, blinded by its own grandeur, saw none of this. When Alaric Moreau's advisors reviewed Varelli's credentials, they found little but deemed it the eccentricity of an artist. Alaric, preoccupied with steel contracts in Albany, left the project to Evelyne, and Lucien slipped seamlessly into her world. He adapted his demeanor with precision. With servants, he was courteous but distant. With tradesmen, exacting. With Evelyne, something altogether different. He studied her as if she were a canvas, measuring the shadows across her face as she read, noting the pauses between her words when she listened to Schumann. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a symbol of wealth, but as a woman. Yet this was no mere seduction. Lucien had a purpose. Among the blueprints he proposed for Solmer Hall's new performance wing were structural anomalies, thin staircases leading nowhere, false walls built 2 feet deep, floor plans misaligned with the existing architecture. When construction began in late spring, overseen by a crew he handpicked from a neighboring town, no one questioned the oddities. The men worked quietly, their foreign tongues a barrier to gossip. A subbasement was added, ostensibly to improve acoustics, but it extended beyond the foundation, carved into the hillside beneath the performance space. The walls were lined with thick clay tiles, and a single iron door, imported from Germany, was fitted into a recess hidden from guests. When Evelyne inquired about the room, Lucien smiled and called it storage. "Every opera house has its shadows," he said, his tone light. She laughed, perhaps believing him or perhaps choosing not to know. By midsummer, the studio was complete, its air filled with the scent of fresh plaster and cedar. A small orchestra tested the acoustics, and Evelyne invited 10 guests to a private performance. Lucien played the piano himself, his fingers coaxing melodies that left the Ashbury standard breathless with praise. A triumph of design, a palace of sound. But no one recorded the movements of the quiet man who left Solmare Hall just before midnight. He came and went like a shadow, unnoticed by the society columns that tracked every cufflink and cocktail among Ashbury's elite. His coat always seemed to carry the scent of fresh-cut wood, the collar dusted with sawdust, and the soles of his boots tracked with streaks of reddish clay. He looked out of place in the marble and crystal corridors of Solmare, and yet, somehow, he belonged there more than many of Evelyne's polished guests. He had the rough grace of someone who worked with his hands, and the silence of someone who had learned long ago that words could be dangerous. No one knew where he lived. Lucien never gave an address, not even on the guest lists that were submitted for parties. It was whispered he lived between commissions, sometimes at a guest house by the lake with a single flickering porch light, sometimes in the gardener's shed behind Solmare's east lawn. There were rumors, of course. Some claimed he'd once worked on the chapel restoration in Prague, others that he had no past at all, only a string of aliases and unfinished sculptures left behind in foreign cities. But the truth remained fluid, as difficult to hold as the mist that curled over the lake at dusk. Even Evelyne didn't seem to know exactly where he went when he wasn't by her side, and yet, she trusted him with a kind of unspoken faith that unnerved her closest confidants. By the time the leaves began to bronze and fall, Evelyne had done something no one expected, something unthinkable for a woman of her position. Quietly, carefully, she began to move pieces of her empire. A necklace of blue diamonds, once worn at the king's winter ball, was sold to a discreet Viennese broker who required no questions. 2 oil paintings, family heirlooms from her grandfather's Paris estate, vanished from their frames and reappeared months later at a private auction in Madrid, sold under a false name. Bearer bonds, kept untouched for over a decade in a New York vault, were liquidated through a man who spoke with a Balkan accent and carried no verifiable identity. She told no one, not Alaric, not her lawyers, not even her sister-in-law who handled much of the household's financial affairs. Because Lucien had promised something more than romance. The future, freedom, and for the first time in her life, Evelyne believed it was possible to possess something purely her own. Her world had always been gilded, yes, but it had never truly belonged to her. Not until Lucien. She thought she was being careful. She thought she was stepping lightly, unseen. But she was wrong, because love may blind the heart, but trust, when misplaced, can undo an entire kingdom. And in Solmare's silent halls, the first cracks had already begun to form, quiet but irreversible. Ashbury didn't need facts. It thrived on tempo, on whispers and glances held too long. By October 1885, Evelyne Moreau had become the subject of an orchestration far more intricate than any performance in her music salon. It began in drawing rooms. The Beaksley matriarch, Eleanor, removed her from the host committee of the candlelight ball without explanation. The Arundels canceled a dinner invitation, citing illness, though they dined at the L. Clerk estate that night. Then came the newspaper's silence. The Ashbury Standard's Winter Society roundup omitted her name, her gowns, her guests for the first time in 8 years. It was deliberate, and she noticed. Lucien tried to soothe her, calling it the cost of being extraordinary, a burden borne by women who defied rules. But Evelyne, raised to read between lines, knew the truth. She had seen this before, years earlier, when Florence Wexler was cast out after rumors of an inappropriate correspondence. No scandal confirmed, yet her erasure complete. Ashbury preferred silence over confrontation, and Evelyne refused to retreat. She wore brighter colors, hosted bolder salons, invited painters and pianists of questionable morality. One evening, she welcomed a female sculptor from New York who smoked cigars and spoke openly of her mistress. Ashbury gasped and stepped back, but the real damage came from what she had begun to uncover. Through Lucian's renovations, she learned of oddities, inconsistencies in the blueprints of neighboring estates, secret doors, false walls, hidden safes. She found lists, client names scribbled in margins, numbers that didn't add up. Some clients were her friends. Others were men whose fortunes underpinned the town's charities. Lucian didn't volunteer these findings, but Evelyne saw them. She asked questions. Why would someone need a locked subvault beneath a guest room? Lucian shrugged, calling it privacy. Even the wealthy have secrets. But it wasn't just privacy. Evelyne began to suspect a larger truth lurked behind Ashbury's elegance. And when she asked Lucian if he'd ever been paid in favors or documents, he fell silent. Still, she stayed close, drawn by a newfound power. For once, she held leverage over the society that had ruled her. But Ashbury forgave no woman who wielded it. By November, anonymous letters arrived at Solmare Hall. Thin slips warning, "You've been seen. You'll ruin him. Think of your name." Then came a box at the gatehouse, containing a velvet pouch with one of the Moreau family's signet rings. Burned along the band, no note, just ash. Evelyne said nothing to Lucian, but her demeanor shifted. She grew watchful, stopped visiting town, canceled the Solmare Winter Gala, a move that shocked even her allies. The Beaksley, Arundel, Morgan, and Cavendish families convened for the first time in a decade, meeting in the wine room of the Morgan estate. Present were two industrialists, a senator's son, and a representative from Blackwell and Company, a discreet firm specializing in risk containment. They deemed Evelyne a liability not just for Lucian but for what she knew. The mechanism of her fall was set with surgical precision, and though clever, she had no inkling of its speed. The evening of December 3rd, 1885, began like any other. Lamplight glowed behind frosted glass at Solmare Hall. A fire burned low in the music salon, and Evelyne, wrapped in sapphire velvet, stood by the eastern window, watching the lake darken to ink. She was alone, Alaric absent, Lucian due to finalize new blueprints for an expansion she insisted upon, though the first project was barely complete. No guests were expected. No servants lingered beyond their duties. Even Raphael, the chef, had the night off. She needed quiet, not for reflection, but for control. Evelyne had decided to confront Lucian, not about the affair, which had always been transparent, but about the fragments that didn't add up. Hidden rooms matching the Beaksley estate, his silence on clients, his tension at the mention of Blackwell and Company. Rumors from the kitchens and stables spoke of a man like him in Hartford, entering government buildings. She dismissed it as paranoia, until that afternoon, when she opened a drawer in his drafting table and found a letter, half burned as if forgotten. The handwriting wasn't his, but the message chilled her. Target secured. Leverage accessible through secondary route. Hold further modifications. Await instructions. The initials at the bottom, B & Co., pointed to Blackwell and Company. Evelyne folded the letter into her robe and waited. Lucian arrived at 8, bringing no satchel, no plans, just a bottle of champagne and that look that once made her forget herself. But tonight she measured him. They talked in the music room. She poured the drinks, he toasted to progress. She sipped lightly, he drank deeply. Then she asked, "Who else did you build those compartments for?" He blinked, smiled. "You've been reading again." "I'm not joking, Lucian." Silence, then softly, "Why would you ask me that?" "Because I found a note in your desk from someone whose business isn't design." He said nothing, so she pressed, "Are you working for them?" Still silence. He set down his glass, stood. "I was sent here," he said finally. "But not for you." The room tilted. Evelyne steadied herself against the piano bench. "Then for what?" Lucian looked at her, not with guilt or regret, but with sorrow, for what always needs hiding. She should have screamed, run, but she didn't. Evelyne Moreau had made her choices, and some part of her had always known she played with fire. Lucian was not just an escape. He was an extension of Ashbury's darkest truth, that even the illusion of power could get a woman killed. He stepped forward, reaching into his coat. She flinched, but he produced a small bundle, her letters to him over 9 months, tied in blue silk. "I'm leaving," he said. "Tonight. I booked passage 2 days ago. I won't be back." "And what am I to do with this?" she asked, voice trembling. He placed the bundle on the piano. "Whatever you wish. Burn them, publish them, bury them in the garden, but don't follow me." Then he kissed her once, lightly, reverently, and was gone. Evelyne didn't sleep that night. She sat in the salon until the fire died, holding the silk-tied letters, reading them by candlelight, each a reminder of her feelings and her exposure. By dawn, she had decided. If Lucian was leaving, if his part was done, hers was just beginning. She would expose them, all of them, the rooms, the secrets, the ledgers, the illicit dealings buried behind polished wood. She would burn down the society that built her, and Ashbury would learn that even its winter queen could be dangerous when cornered. The hum deepens, a clock ticks faintly, signaling the turn of fate. And so, dear listener, the stage is set for a confrontation that would echo beyond the walls of Solmare Hall. Join me as we follow Evelyne into the heart of her defiance, where power meets peril, and the price of truth is paid in silence. Her story is far from over. Evelyne Moreau's resolve crystallized in the bitter cold of that fateful December night, a resolve forged not in defiance, but in necessity. Her entire life had been sculpted by others, by inheritance, by expectation, by the rituals of society that dictated who she was and how far she could reach. But that night, December 10th, 1885, marked a quiet rebellion. No fanfare, no witnesses, only the soft clatter of hooves on frost-hardened cobblestone and the whisper of something coming undone. The carriage arrived without escort, veiled in shadow, pulling up not to the grand colonnaded front of the Elmage Club, but to a narrow passageway behind it, an entrance meant for servants and shipments, not for someone of Evelyne's stature. The Elmage Club itself was a fortress of exclusivity, hidden in plain sight between the old Ashbury Library and the imposing stone facade of the Ashbury Bank and Trust. There was no sign to announce its purpose. One simply knew if one belonged. Membership was not requested, nor granted by application. It was inherited, a birthright carved into dusty ledgers whose ink had long since faded, but whose authority endured. Evelyne stepped down from the carriage alone. She wore no jewels that evening, not a single glimmer on her wrist or throat. Her hands were bare despite the cold, the absence of gloves making her fingers ache with every breath of winter air. Her hair was pinned severely, not a curl left loose to soften her expression. She wore no rouge, no powder. Her beauty, while undeniable, was stripped of ornament. It was not a night for masks. Beneath her arm, clutched tightly in a worn leather folio, was the letter creased and yellowing, though its contents were sharp enough to wound. She had found it in the false bottom of Lucian's desk drawer 3 nights prior, hidden beneath architectural sketches and graphite rubbings of old cathedral arches. She had read it twice by candlelight, her pulse quickening with each word, and once more at dawn, just to be sure she had not imagined it. The letter had changed everything. It was not a confession exactly, but it spoke of plans, names, locations, bank details, coded instructions. There were references to auctions and transfers, foreign contacts she did not recognize. And there, in Lucian's unmistakable hand, was mention of her. Not in affection, but as an asset, a leverage point, a means to an end. She had stared at the final line for nearly an hour, the ink smudged just slightly, as if written in haste. She suspects nothing. Timing must be precise. Now, Evelyne stood on the threshold of the Elmage Club, the letter resting like a blade in its sheath. She was not there for explanations. She was not there for justice. She was there to dismantle the illusion that had kept her captive. She would step into the heart of power with no armor but the truth, and that, she had come to realize, was all she needed. Inside, the club was cloaked in silence, its air heavy with the scent of aged wood and cigar smoke. She was ushered through 2 parlors and a curtained hallway until she reached a narrow room lined in dark velvet. 4 men waited at a round table, already set with port and cigars. None rose. The youngest, Martin Arundel, barely 30, yet already whispering into senatorial ears, gestured to a chair. "You wish to speak," he said, his tone a mockery of courtesy, more a warning than an invitation. Evelyne sat, the silence that followed cultivated by men accustomed to breaking others first. She didn't flinch. Instead, she opened her folio and placed it flat on the table, then another and another. 3 folders, each containing pages copied in her hand, blueprints of modified estates, transcripts of overheard names, receipts connecting shipping accounts to off-ledger bank deposits, all tied to the crests of 4 families that graced more charity invitations than court records. "I know what you've built," she said calmly, her voice steady as steel. "And I know why." Charles Beeksley, known for his monotone disdain, leaned forward, glancing at the papers. "This is all circumstantial," he said, his voice like cracking ice. "Is it?" Evelyne replied, "Because if I sent copies to the New York Herald, I suspect their headline writers would disagree." No one spoke. The crackle of the fire behind her, the slow exhale of cigar smoke from Henry Morgan, whose rail holdings stretched from Massachusetts to Chicago, filled the void. Finally, Morgan broke the silence. "What do you want?" Evelyne met his gaze, unflinching. "I want out. Passage to Europe on my terms. I want Lucian Varelli's debts paid, his name cleared. And I want $100,000 in gold placed in a Swiss account under a name of my choosing." The men exchanged glances. "In return," she continued, "I disappear from Ashbury, from America, and from memory." "You're assuming we trust you to keep quiet," Morgan said, his eyes narrowing. "I'm assuming you understand what happens if I don't." A pause hung heavy, then Martin Arundel laughed softly. "She's bluffing. There's no way she could have gotten all this." Evelyne reached into her coat and slid a final envelope across the table. Inside was a list of names. 3 sat in the room, the 4th a federal judge in Boston tied to an illegal land deal. "That's not all I have," she said. "It's just the beginning." For 6 hours they talked. Details were debated, conditions revised. Beeksley threatened litigation. Morgan offered double if she'd never write of Ashbury again, even in fiction. Evelyne remained composed, her resolve a shield. By dawn, the deal was struck. She would leave on January 5, 1886, sailing from New York as Clara de St. Laurent, with a forged passport and a cash-laden steamer trunk. Lucian's debts, though denied, would be settled through a dummy corporation. The $100,000 would transfer to a discreet account in Bern by year's end. But the men had demands. She must leave alone, Lucian already in Europe, no contact for 2 years. She would sign a statement attesting her departure was voluntary, prompted by fatigue, and never return to American soil or speak to Ashbury society, not even Alaric. Evelyne read the document twice, then signed. When asked if she needed more, she smiled faintly. "Yes, I want room 11 at the Marquette Pavilion, facing the lake." The men exchanged confused looks. "It's where I plan to spend my final week." From December 28, 1885, to the early morning of January 4, 1886, Evelyne lived not as a woman preparing to flee, but as someone folding up a life with deliberate care. She checked into room 11 under her maiden name, Evelyne Desamps, the reservation made through a proxy. The concierge, Louis Maddox, noted her 2 light trunks and her request for meals in her room. She declined visitors, the New Year's Eve ball, even her favorite jasmine tea, choosing bitter black coffee instead. Each morning, she walked to the lake's edge, sitting for hours on an iron bench facing the frozen shoreline, her cheeks raw from the wind. She wrote pages in a velvet-covered notebook, tearing some out, mailing others. Louis later recalled her posting a dozen envelopes, none with return addresses, all sealed in red wax. On December 30th, she summoned a local photographer, Joseph Halberd, expecting a formal session. What he found unsettled him for years. Evelyne in sapphire blue velvet, The same gown from the night Lucian left, adorned only with her mother's star-shaped sapphire pendant. She sat for 3 hours requesting multiple exposures, serene, smiling, solemn, asking for 2 prints each and the negatives burned. "Why?" Halberd asked. "Because what I leave behind must be exactly what I choose," she replied. "No more, no less." That night, she declined dinner, ordered warm milk, and left a tip so generous Maddox refused it until she whispered, "Money is no good when you're gone." On January 2nd, she hired a carriage, riding through Ashbury for 10 hours, visiting places that no longer bore her name: Solmare Hall, the theater of her first opera soiree, the chapel where she married Alaric. The driver, Thomas Wills, said she wept silently at each stop, yet never wiped her tears. She wasn't saying goodbye to people, he later told police. She was saying goodbye to time. The final photograph, timestamped January 3rd at 10:16 p.m., showed her in profile, hands folded, the pendant gleaming, her expression peaceful, absolute. She paid in gold coin and left without a word. The last confirmed sighting came at 11:45 p.m. on January 4th. Lewis Maddox saw her descending the main staircase in a traveling coat, carrying a small leather case, her face unreadable. "Do you need a carriage, madam?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "No, my arrangements are already made." She stepped into the winter fog, vanishing into the gray. She didn't appear for her steamer the next morning, never boarded the train to New York. Room 11, when opened later, appeared untouched, save for a folded sheet on the pillow, unaddressed and signed. It read, "Even silence leaves an echo. If you hear it, don't look away." The official missing persons report was filed at 4:20 p.m. on January 5th, less than 6 hours after she failed to reach Grand Central. It came not from Alaric or a friend, but from Henry Morganthal, a banking intermediary tasked with her offshore account, nervous not for her safety but for the paper trail. Ashbury's chief constable, Samuel Renick, a former Pinkerton man turned sheriff, skilled in discreet inquiries, began with room 11. The door was locked from inside, no forced entry, her trunk untouched, gown laid carefully across a chaise. The fire was low but warm, the gas lamp extinguished properly. The only note was that cryptic line on the pillow. What struck Renick wasn't what remained, but what was gone: her sapphire pendant, her leather folio, the half-dozen letters she'd mailed, confirmed by Maddox but never received by anyone. Renick checked the pavilion's postal ledger. Dates scratched out, initials faded, tampered with. The housemaid, Clara, recalled entering on January 2nd to deliver towels. The carpet near the desk was damp, smelling of ink and turpentine. Someone had burned something. Renick sifted the fireplace ashes, finding fragments of a handwritten note, scorched but legible. "They don't expect me to survive this, but I cannot let it vanish with me. Morgan, Arundel, even Beaksley. I saw the vault. It's real." The signature, torn but unmistakable, E.M. It was enough to raise alarm, but not yet charges. Renick retraced every step of her final days with a precision born of desperation. He began with Halberd, the old groundskeeper who had last seen her near the edge of the Winter Gardens 2 days before she vanished. Halberd had described her as distant, yes, but not confused. "Strange," he said, "like someone listening for something the rest of us couldn't hear, but clear-eyed, like she'd already made up her mind." He remembered the way she paused before speaking, as if weighing each word. She had asked no questions, made no small talk, just a quiet farewell and a nod, as though she knew it would be the last. Wills, the pavilion clerk, offered more. She had left detailed instructions for the delivery of a letter, sealed in black wax, and tucked a gold half-eagle into his palm when she handed it off. "Her last favor," he called it with a strange reverence, "told me to wait 2 full days before sending it. Not 1 hour earlier." But the most disturbing lead came from the guest ledger at the Pavilion Hotel. It was Renick's 3rd visit before the night manager finally handed it over with a warning glance. January 3rd, well past midnight. An unregistered guest had entered the lobby, tall, wearing a gray overcoat, hat pulled low, and gloves that didn't belong to a man of ordinary means. Too fine for a salesman, the manager had whispered. The man had not signed his name. Surveillance was minimal and his visit brief. He left something behind, but whatever it was had vanished before dawn. No one remembered what it had been, or claimed not to. To Renick, it no longer looked like a disappearance. It looked like a silencing. Evelyne hadn't failed to escape. She had been intercepted, removed, covered up. Each trail Renick followed dissolved into fog. Witnesses recanted their statements. Documents that once existed were suddenly lost or never filed at all. At the Ashbury Bank and Trust, he was stonewalled by attorneys who spoke in veiled warnings. One locked drawer he demanded to examine was met with a quiet threat of legal action for overreach. Even Lucian's allies had begun to turn cold, some out of fear, others complicity. Alaric was the bluntest of them. "She's gone," he said flatly over a glass of brandy. "She made her choice. Let the dead rest." But Renick knew better. She wasn't officially declared dead. There was no body, no ceremony, just a vacuum where she had once been. A woman erased, not lost. And that absence spoke louder than any grave. Renick had come to believe the truth was buried not by time, but by design. Every lead tightened around the same shadowed circle of influence, one that stretched higher than he dared suspect. The question was no longer what had happened to Evelyne Moreau. It was who had wanted her gone, and why. 3 weeks in, Renick received an unsigned note slipped under his office door. "You're asking the wrong men. Ask the woman who worked the Elmage Lane estate. She saw everything." R.W. The handwriting matched a 1883 letter to the Ashbury Chronicle accusing the Arundels of labor abuses, buried before printing. He followed the trail to Elmage Lane, finding Mrs. Rosalind Weaver, a seamstress in her 60s, face lined with years of needles and whispers. She answered before he knocked. "I've been expecting someone," she said, her room smelling of lavender and starch. She sat, unprompted, and began. "I worked at the Arundel house for 8 years, alterations, upholstery. They trusted me because I kept quiet. But that night, January 4th, I saw something no stitch can hold shut. I was delivering a hemmed overcoat past 11. Light in the back parlor was unusual. The family was supposed to be in New York. I took the side path, planning to leave it with the housekeeper, but I saw shadows. 3 figures. One was her, Evelyne, in that dark blue coat with silver buttons like eyes. She paused, swallowing hard. She wasn't alone. According to Mrs. Weaver, Evelyne stood in the courtyard behind the Arundel estate, flanked by 2 men in long coats, faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats. One held a document folder. The other watched, still as stone. Evelyne gestured, arguing. One man raised a hand, not to strike, but to silence. They spoke too softly to hear, but her face showed resignation, not pleading. Renick asked why she hadn't come forward. "Because I've seen what happens when women like her cross men like them. I didn't want to be next." "But you're here now," he pressed. She met his gaze. "Because someone has to say it. They didn't let her leave. They took her." Details were scarce. The light that night had been uncooperative, more shadow than substance, and her vantage point, partially obscured by an overgrown lilac hedge, offered little clarity. Mrs. Weaver hadn't intended to see anything at all. She was out in her garden for air, drawn by a restless feeling she couldn't shake. "I wasn't spying," she told Renick, voice brittle with age and memory. "I just felt something was wrong. You know that sense, when the world holds its breath." She had stood still, half cloaked in moonlight, half forgotten behind the blossoms, as the figure moved across the path. It was a woman, alone, walking with a strange mix of urgency and grace, neither hurried nor hesitant, as though the night itself parted for her. Mrs. Weaver hadn't seen her face, only the outline of a long coat brushing against frost-covered shrubs. But there was one thing she remembered with startling clarity. Just as the woman turned the corner into the back corridor of the estate, a shaft of moonlight slipped between the bare branches and struck her collar. And there it was, the pendant, a sapphire the size of a robin's egg, set into a brooch shaped like a crescent of frozen flame. It glimmered with unnatural brilliance, casting a pale blue light against the fabric of her coat, not just reflecting the moon, glowing somehow. Alive. That brooch, Mrs. Weaver whispered, fingers trembling around the chipped teacup in her lap. I'll never forget it. I've seen sapphires before. Never one like that. It didn't shine, it glowed. Renick had said nothing at the time, only nodded and thanked her for her honesty. But inside he was trembling, because that brooch, the sapphire pendant, was the one missing from room 11 of the Pavilion Hotel. It had been catalogued by the clerk during the initial search. Evelyne Moreau's jewelry case was mostly untouched, but that single item was noted absent. And even more damning, it had appeared in her final known photograph, worn proudly at her throat. A formal portrait taken just 2 days before her disappearance. No one should have seen it again, yet Mrs. Weaver had. And that detail, unprompted, impossible to guess, aligned too perfectly with the known facts to be coincidence. Her account was shaky, yes, but sincere. The pendant, the coat, the hour, they all fit. Too precisely. Still, Renick's attempts to confirm her story fell flat. No one else reported seeing Evelyne that night. The house staff at the Arundel estate claimed ignorance. No carriage tracks had been preserved in the frozen dirt. The gardeners denied having trimmed the lilacs in over a month. And Mrs. Weaver's name brought only weary sighs from the local constables. Lovely woman, they said, but always seeing shadows. Yet Renick couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen something real, something meant to remain hidden. He returned to town and dug deeper. He cross-referenced travel logs, social diaries, and city records. It took 2 days to uncover what should have been obvious. The Arundels, powerful, old money, and famously aloof, had claimed to be in New York during the week of Evelyne's disappearance. A benefit gala, a charity ball, a flurry of public events. Their staff confirmed it. Their schedule was airtight, but it was all a lie. Their travel papers, Renick discovered, were unsigned. A clerical gap, but in that world, gaps like that didn't happen by accident. He checked the hotel registries. The Arundels had no recorded stay in the city during that week. No sightings, no press photographs, and worst of all, no witnesses. They had never left Ashbury. They were home, and Evelyne had come to them. Renick could feel the edges of the story sharpening, taking form. Evelyne hadn't vanished into the night. She had approached something or someone with purpose, and that someone had answered not with hospitality or help, but with silence. Why? The Arundels had always moved above the law, above suspicion. Generations of power, built on land, banks, and influence that ran like roots beneath the city. Evelyne, though respected, had never been part of their circle. She was admired, even feared, but not embraced. Her presence was tolerated the way a comet is tolerated in the night sky. Fascinating, beautiful, but far too unpredictable. And unpredictable women had a way of disappearing in Ashbury. Perhaps she had uncovered something, or perhaps her intentions were merely inconvenient. Renick didn't know yet, but he was sure of one thing. The Arundels saw her as a threat. That made them dangerous. He revisited the Pavilion Hotel, asked again for the night ledger. This time he pointed to a different date, cross-checked the records of staff rotations, deliveries, guest entries. He noticed something small. A shipment of wine crates, scheduled for the 4th, arrived early, signed for by a man who didn't exist. The name was familiar in the worst way. One used before in false registrations, travel aliases, shady property transactions. A ghost name, the kind the Arundels were known to use when they didn't want to leave fingerprints. Renick stared at the signature, cold settling in his chest. It was beginning to unravel. The lie, the cover-up, the way the town bent around certain families like iron drawn to a magnet. And in the center of it all, Evelyne, still unaccounted for, still missing, but not forgotten. She had come back that night with the pendant at her throat, like a signal. She had entered through the back, as if avoiding the front entirely. Perhaps she was lured. Perhaps she believed she had leverage, evidence, a secret, something she thought could protect her. Or perhaps she simply wanted to confront the machine that had tried to box her in since the day she arrived in Ashbury. Whatever her motive, She had walked into the lion's den, and the town had watched, then turned away. Renick closed his notebook and stared out across the Ashbury skyline, the fading sun casting long shadows over slate roofs and steeples. Somewhere behind one of those windows, someone knew the full story. Someone had seen more than a flicker of blue light through the hedge. Someone had heard her voice, maybe even her final words. And they were silent. But Renick would not be. Not now. Not after the pendant. Not after Mrs. Weaver. Evelyne Moreau wasn't a ghost. Not yet. And so, dear listener, the pieces of this dark puzzle begin to take shape. Evelyne's defiance drew her into a trap, and the men who built Ashbury's empire moved to silence her forever. Stay with me as we uncover the chilling truth buried beneath the Arundel estate, where her story takes its most harrowing turn.